World of Warfare presents
Allied Air Supremacy in the ETO. Strategic disagreements between Allied air leadership reached a zenith in the spring of 1944, several months before the planned D-Day invasions of northern France. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy commander, and Sir Charles Portal, chief of the RAF, took exception to General Karl Toohey Spaatz, who oversaw all strategic air operations in the European theater of operations. Spaatz favored a concerted attack on Axis oil in both Germany and the Balkans, while Tedder, although fully cognizant of Axis oil's vulnerability to Allied bombardment, felt that Axis oil production would bounce back too rapidly, further reducing the chance for Allied air supremacy in advance of the D-Day invasion plans. Tedder and Portal favored attacks on oil production marshalling yards, and when Eisenhower favored the railhead strategy, Spaatz had no other option but to acquiesce. However, in a clear act of insubordination, Spaatz, along with General Ira Aker, head of the 8th Air Force flying out of innumerable air bases in England, and 15th Air Force leader General Nathan Twining, subtly encouraged airmen to bomb marshalling yards with guaranteed high levels of spillage falling on adjacent oil refineries. High-altitude strategic bombing, after all, had already proven to be a less than precise undertaking, far from the early boast by Norden bomb sight inventor Carl Norden about dropping bombs into a pickle barrel. In defiance of the rearmament ban imposed on Germany following the Huns' defeat in World War I, before the Nazi invasion of Poland that triggered the Second World War, Germany came into the war with the largest, most well-trained air force in the world. German aeronautical engineers produced a succession of novel fighter designs, while its aircraft production labor force maintained high standards of mechanical perfection in their end product. Despite these fundamental attributes, the Luftwaffe suffered greatly from managerial incompetence, bungled military planning, and a deep adherence to craft rather than the efficiencies of mass production. On the other hand, as the Wehrmacht began to experience fuel shortages due to the Allies' increasingly accelerated bombing campaigns against Axis oil, from May 1944 to the end of the war in Europe, both the German economy and Germany's ability to wage war became an increasingly challenged commitment. As the Luftwaffe's air supremacy began to collapse, Germany was compelled to divert approximately 2 million workers from munitions and armament production to anti-aircraft defense of the Reich's most vital and threatened industries and resources. In the final 6 months of 1943, average aircrew loss rates among Allied heavy bomber crews hovered around 4% per mission, making it statistically impossible for an American heavy bomber crew to complete their 25-mission tour of duty. 6 months later, however, with the arrival of increasing numbers of new bombers and highly trained air crews, attrition rates began to drop. When the P-51 Mustang joined the fight, the Luftwaffe began to experience unsustainable monthly loss rates of 25% of her pilots and 50% of her aircraft. By the start of Big Week in late February 1944, the Allies now had a superior long-range fighter escort in the Mustang, plus an armada of heavy bombers capable of achieving the Allies' goal of crushing the Luftwaffe both in the air and on the ground. While the Americans continued to inject men and aircraft into the Allied war effort, Luftwaffe Air Marshal Adolf Galland felt the pinch of reduced oil in his ability to maintain air superiority over Europe. Oil shortages reduced the number of pilot training hours, leaving the Reich under-defended from the air, while her ground forces were made vulnerable to increasing attacks by Allied fighter bombers. In March, for example, Galland lost 20% of his experienced pilots as they faced off with a staggering increase in Allied heavy bombers and fighters in far greater numbers than their own. Declining morale in the Luftwaffe led some of her most zealous pilots to take desperate measures in an attempt to disrupt Allied bomber streams. Loyal pilots joined Sturmstaffel 1, or Storm Group Squadron. Heavily armored FW-190s, known as the Butcher Bird, formed up in flying wedges behind lighter fast attack fighters, intending to shoot down Allied bombers from close range at any price. Ramming the rear flight surfaces of Allied heavy bombers was a fundamental strategy of the Sturmstaffel, and if a Luftwaffe fighter was fatally crippled in the offensive, it was reasoned, the pilot could always bail out and live to fight another day. The Storm Group's suicide tactic proved to be a menace only when bomber streams flew over enemy targets with insufficient escort coverage, forcing the suicide pilots to lay in wait for such rare targets of opportunity. Nevertheless, when Allied escorts failed to rendezvous with heavy bomber formations, the Wolfpack tactics of the Storm Group exacted heavy losses to Allied airmen, who found themselves outnumbered by enemy fighters, oftentimes by as much as 10 to 1. Describing the Storm Group's suicidal outlook, Oscar Bosch, a Sturmstaffel volunteer, recalled, "You are 20 years old and you think you're a rough and tough. You can drink all night and please the girls. Then in the morning you climb into your 190 with a huge hangover. You turn the oxygen regulator to 100%, and when you take off to engage 500 Wehrmachts or heavy bombers, you are immediately sober." After the Soviets' second Jassy-Kishinev offensive led to the defeat of Romania and subsequent leadership coup d'etat, Germany was suddenly deprived of her heavy reliance on Ploesti oil, which contributed upwards of 60% of Germany's wartime supply of fuel. After the June invasion, the Luftwaffe was nearly non-existent in much of the Mediterranean theater of operations, comprising just 2 groups of JG-77s in Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean, and 1 group of JG-53s in Hungary. By September, the 15th's heavy bomber loss statistics reflected the dwindling influences of Luftwaffe fighter interdiction in air combat over strategic Axis targets. In August, when aircraft losses topped out at 171, the highest monthly loss total in full War 15th history, overall aircraft losses dropped to 68 by the end of September. Bomber losses to enemy fighters nearly vanished after the fall of Ploesti, plummeting from 91 in August to 7 in September. By May of 1944, compounding factors led to Allied air supremacy over the Luftwaffe. Struggling under fuel shortages, the Luftwaffe was forced to cut its fighter pilot training from over 200 hours to just 111. Secondarily, while Allied aircrews were cycled back home after a fixed number of missions, Luftwaffe pilots, due to high attrition rates, were by necessity forced to stay in the fight to the bitter end. Many new pilots reported to their units with less than 20 hours of flight time in fighter aircraft, which placed them at a severe disadvantage when faced with the superior training of American fighter pilots and the lethal performance characteristics of the P-51 Mustang. Luftwaffe pilots were triple damned, as historian Barrett Tillman points out, in his words, outnumbered by better trained opponents flying generally superior aircraft. And of course, enough aviation fuel necessary to keep them in the air. By the close of war in Europe, American industrial might had delivered 20 times more planes than the Germans could manage to produce, resulting in permanent Allied air superiority in the skies over Europe after May of 1944. By late summer, fuel shortages began to cripple the German economy, severely impacting military activities at a time when Allied forces were closing in on the Huns from both the eastern and western fronts. During a bloodied retreat from the Falaise Pocket, the Germans' 5th Panzer Army was forced to abandon fuel-starved tanks and vehicles as they fled the slaughter that took the lives of well over 10,000 German soldiers. The Luftwaffe was forced to close most of its training facilities, diverting future air cadets to the infantry, while flight instructors were reassigned to flak batteries in defense of Axis oil refineries and key munitions plants. For the Luftwaffe, the summer of 1944 became a nightmare from which there was no awakening Luftwaffe pilot Heinz Knock wrote in his diary. Knock's squadron lost an average of 5 pilots every mission, and when German air commanders sent, in his words, battered old crates up against superior formations of American-made fighters, Knock concluded that his superiors' orders were nothing less than murder. Despite the Luftwaffe's loss of air supremacy, German air aces continue to bring the fight with heroic determination and inevitable loss of life. Franz Stigler was shot down so many times that he jokingly said he should receive paratrooper pay instead of pilot's pay, while top fighter ace George Peter Eder was shot down 17 times, sustaining injuries in all but 3 of his crashes. After being wounded in one eye, Eckhard Tichy continued to fly until he collided with his 9th Allied bomber kill, most likely due to an impairment in depth perception. Of the top 25 Luftwaffe fighter pilots, 40% died in action. While the destruction of the Luftwaffe and the bombardment-style reductions to German infrastructure have long been debated from a moral and ethical standpoint, the results tilted the needle heavily towards an overwhelming Allied victory. In light of one German writer's summation that Allied strategic bombing was wasteful, inhumane, and ineffective, historian Edward Jablonski floats a different conclusion in his comprehensive book Flying Fortress. He writes, "The implication is that a war waged otherwise would be humane and not wasteful." The effectiveness of the heavy strategic bombardment program in Europe was attested to the death of the Luftwaffe, which was destroyed in the air and on the ground, and in the denial of fuel to the Nazi war machine. No better exemplification of this may be suggested than the absence of air opposition to the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944. While the Nazis lost the battle for air supremacy over Europe, their efforts to thwart Allied bombardment intensified with the use of Grossbatterien mobile flak units and the employment of rapidly expanding numbers of anti-aircraft personnel. Beginning in the summer of 1944 and continuing throughout the war in Europe, Germany confounded Allied intelligence officers by relocating flak batteries on flatbed train cars and trucks. Generally used in defense of Nazi oil, Grossbatterien consisted of 3 flak batteries of 4 guns each, which effectively increased the density of flak rounds exploding inside bomber formations, making the skies over Europe even more deadly for Allied airmen. With the remains of the Luftwaffe now grounded, by June of 1944, radar-guided flak dropped more Allied bombers than enemy fighters, at a ratio bordering on 10-1. Germany's woes grew ever more dire when industrial targets otherwise inaccessible to the 15th and 8th Air Force bombers were suddenly within reach, when in early 1944, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin allowed U.S. heavy bombers to stage attacks from 3 Ukrainian air bases. 700 miles north of Budapest and approximately 1,185 miles from the 15th's Foggia Plain air bases, the proposed shuttle missions allowed Allied heavy bombers to reach industrial targets in Latvia and western Poland for the first time during the war. While FDR sought to build a stronger relationship with the Soviets, plus the potential establishment of Siberian air bases from which the U.S. could strike Japan, Spotts and Aker recognized a 2-for-1 opportunity to bring the fight to Axis targets that stood previously out of reach. In a rare show of Soviet collaboration, Stalin's February approval of the shuttle mission plan allowed Allied heavies to attack Eastern European targets en route to Russia before striking additional targets on their return flights home. Originally dubbed Operation Frantic Joe, the name was shortened to Operation Frantic in an effort to remove any unintended diplomatic offense to the Soviet leader. While the Soviets hungered for the benefits of Allied attacks on targets beyond the scope of the Red Air Force's range and capability, they limited the number of American ground personnel to no more than 1,200. Under the leadership of Major General Robert I. Walsh of the U.S. Eastern Command, Operation Frantic required a logistical ballet of pre-staged men and supplies necessary to sustain even a limited campaign of heavy bombardment. In a 4-month scramble toward full readiness, the U.S. Transport Command flew in parts and munitions from Iran, including high-octane fuel not available in the Soviet Union. American heavy bombers staged out of Poltava and Mirgorod air bases, while American fighters used the shorter runway available at Pereakton. Intended to be a limited 10-day, 3-mission raid, Frantic 1 was a closely held secret until air leaders informed crews at the last possible moment, in some cases as little as 2 hours before wheels up. The 2nd, 97th, 99th, 301st, and 463rd Bomb Groups flew their first mission on June 2nd, putting up 130 B-17s and 69 P-51s for escort by the 325th Cottontails. Aker flew as co-pilot in a bomber named Yankee Doodle 2, belonging to the 97th, flying from Foggia to targets near Debrecen, 120 miles east of Budapest. 4 days after their arrival mission, the bomber stream attacked Galati Airfield in Romania, a 1,600-mile round trip across Romania's shared border with the Ukraine. Bombing results were rated good to excellent, although intelligence officers believed that the damage would soon be repaired if no follow-up raids were scheduled. The Checkertails claimed 6 kills, losing 2 Mustangs and a pilot captured, adding 3 new aces in 1 day. I clobbered an FW-190, and Captain Roy Hogg nearly got himself killed shoving 6 more off my back, Slutter recalled. The mission cost 1 B-17 from the 463rd Bomb Group, but otherwise, the bombers returned to their Foggia air bases largely unscathed.